A new poll conducted by Delta Poll and commissioned by The National has revealed a significant shift in UK voter attitudes towards the conflict in Gaza and arms sales to Israel. The poll finds 1 in 3 UK voters say the war in Gaza will be important in determining how they will vote in the upcoming general election this week. Domestic considerations are still key, but the poll also finds foreign policy is having a bigger influence on voting, especially for young people. Well, here to discuss how the Middle East is impacting the race to run the UK is Mina Al Oraibi. She's editor of The National. Mina, it's great to have you on today, and thank you so much for being here. So to begin, just tell us about the size and scope of this poll and why party positions on the war in Gaza will play a really significant role in the UK election this week.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be on. We decided to commission this poll to understand to what extent the protests we've seen month on month, week on week in UK cities will actually, against the war in Gaza and calling for a ceasefire, will actually be reflected in the vote. And so we commissioned Delta Poll, random sample of British voters, 2,077 respondents. And in that, we found that 32% of those asked said that the war and the Gaza policy of each of the parties will be important in how they determine who they vote for. And it's quite an interesting figure, especially when we look at those who said they would be voting for other parties, so not Labour, Conservative, Reform, or Lib Dems. We're saying that 49% of them felt that the war in Gaza would determine how they would vote. And that's quite an interesting figure because those are the numbers that could reflect Labour taking a hit from traditional voters who feel very strongly that the Labour Party had to take a stronger position or a different position when it comes to the war in Gaza.
And I find this absolutely fascinating because it does give us a really interesting insight into voter attitudes, not just towards the Middle East, but specifically towards the war in Gaza. What's also interesting, Mina, is that Kier Starmer faced a really big party revolt over his original stance on a Gaza ceasefire late last year. He now supports a ceasefire, but he opposes an arms sale embargo on Israel. How do you think that's going to ultimately impact the vote?
It's going to be interesting if, and most likely, Kier Starmer does become Prime Minister of the UK, how he decides to go forward. Now, of course, the Labour Party for years was blighted with accusations of anti-Semitism. So Kier Starmer has to navigate between making sure that he's responding to party supporters and traditional and historic Labour Party policies on the one hand, on the other, responding to the fact that the majority of supporters of Labour would like to see, for example, a banning of arms to Israel. Our poll shows that 62% of voters in support of Labour are in support of banning an arms sale to Israel. And of those voters, also 51% want to see a recognition of the Palestinian state. So these will be important topics for Starmer if he becomes Prime Minister by the end of the week, because of course the war is still ongoing. There's fears of another war in Lebanon starting. So all of this will have to be taken into consideration while making sure that they don't get accused in being anti-Semitic or being against Israel to a point that can't be defended. So it'll be a very important tightrope that he'll have to walk, but he must respond to how the majority of voters or a significant portion of Labour voters and constituents feel about this war.
It's a really good point. And as you and I speak right now, as we have discussed before, the UK could really be on the cusp of an historic leadership here, leadership shift here. And what's also interesting to me is that, look, the UK alongside the US is a really important foreign policy actor in the region. So based on what we now know about Kier Starmer and his previous statements about this region and the Middle East, how would you say he is viewed within the Arab and Gulf states? What is his reputation, his credibility, his standing in this part of the world?
You know, Kier Starmer was largely an unknown entity on the international scene, not just in the region, but particularly in the region. And again, the Labour Party has gone through so many different iterations, let's say, from the Tony Blair and New Labour days through to Jeremy Corbyn. So he was an unknown entity, but with time, he and David Lammy, who's currently Shadow Foreign Secretary and could potentially become Foreign Secretary, have made a point to reach out to different world leaders, including here in the region. I think Kier Starmer is seen as mature, a pragmatist, and somebody who will be a steady hand. It's also interesting that the Tony Blair Institute has been working closely with Labour, and Tony Blair, of course, is well known in the region amongst leaders. He is trusted and he's seen as, again, a serious politician, somebody that you can work with. So I think if Kier Starmer is seen as an extension of that, then there is more, let's say, respect, but also understanding of how he may operate. So it's a wait-and-see approach at the region at the moment. Unfortunately, Britain has largely been absent in the last 2 to 3 years, at least, in terms of foreign policy when it comes to the region. And it could be that with a new Labour government, especially if David Lammy is to become Foreign Secretary, he's made various trips to this region and met with the leaders of this region, then there could be a turning of the page and a really looking to the UK as a foreign policy leader where it's been absent in the last few years, particularly, of course, as the US goes into election season and we're not too sure who's going to be in the White House come January. The UK could play a pivotal role, especially also as France, who has been really instrumental in the region in the last few years, has its own internal troubles with the recent election first round results and coming up the next round of elections.
Absolutely, and you framed it perfectly because we see these elections playing out across the United States and across Europe. The leadership in those countries could have significant implications for Middle East policy and foreign policy broadly moving forward. So, Mina, you mentioned it. I wanted to get your take on this. We've just seen this debate play out in the United States, which seems to have shifted the calculus for President Biden and also raised the stakes that we could see a second Trump presidency stateside. That would have huge implications for the region. How are you reading it right now, and how might a second Trump presidency, approach the Middle East? Would it be similar to what we've seen in the past, or would we expect a significant shift in how the US views this part of the world and, as a result, the policies that it puts forward? How are you reading the situation right now in the US?
The debate was really quite something to watch. It showed the weakness of President Biden, which of course reflects not only on the upcoming elections, but the present at the moment where the US is really needed to have a voice with the ongoing war in Gaza, but also the regional tensions that we're witnessing. In terms of what a second Trump presidency would look like and a second Trump term would look like, one of the differentiating factors will be there won't be the same military retired generals that were quite active in the first Trump presidency, at least in the first couple of years of that presidency. Those military figures, you had people like H.R. McMaster, General Mattis, and others who came in that had ties with the region and also understood the region. You won't be having that. It's also been interesting to see whether Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's son-in-law, will be involved as much as he was previously. He's certainly very involved on the business side. He has extensive ties with particular countries here in the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia. It'd be interesting to see if he will still play that envoy role that he played last time. So a lot of the characters are not well known. Mike Pompeo, again, had lots of ties with the region. He had come out really to challenge Trump, and since then is unlikely to be part of that group that takes over should there be a second Trump presidency. So there's a lot of uncertainty. However, it was very clear from Mr. Trump's statements during the debate that his position on Gaza will be very strong, and he thinks that Israel could continue with the war.